In 1985, IBM and Microsoft sat down together and agreed to build the future of personal computing as genuine partners. Not competitors circling each other warily, actual partners, sharing engineering resources, sharing a roadmap, sharing the explicit goal of replacing the aging, increasingly limited MS-DOS with something considerably more advanced. A real, modern 32-bit operating system called OS/2, designed to bring proper multitasking and a graphical interface to the IBM PC platform, years before most of the industry was ready for either. 5 years later, that partnership was dead. Not through a slow mutual fade, but through a specific, deliberate sequence of decisions Microsoft made while still technically IBM's partner on the project. Decisions that ultimately left IBM holding an operating system many engineers considered genuinely superior, while Microsoft walked away with the actual future of the desktop market in Windows. This is the story of how that happened and why OS/2's fate is one of the more instructive and more quietly damning chapters in Microsoft's entire early history. It's a story that's largely faded from popular memory, overshadowed by the more commonly told tale of Microsoft's rise through DOS and Windows alone, as if Windows simply emerged fully formed and inevitable without ever having to compete against or work alongside a genuine, technically serious rival being built by Microsoft's own engineers under a different company's name. Understanding what actually happened to OS/2 fills in a genuinely important and genuinely underexplored piece of that larger picture. Let's start with why this partnership existed in the first place, because it wasn't some accidental casual collaboration. It was a genuinely serious, high-stakes joint venture between two companies that, at the time, badly needed each other. By the mid-1980s, MS-DOS, the operating system Microsoft had built its early fortune on, was showing its age. DOS could really only run one program at a time, had no built-in graphical interface, and it was fundamentally limited by design decisions made years earlier, back when personal computers were far less capable than the machines shipping by the mid-1980s. Both IBM and Microsoft recognized that DOS's limitations would eventually become a real competitive liability, and both companies had genuine reasons to want a replacement built together rather than separately. IBM's motivation was straightforward. The company had essentially created the modern PC industry with the original IBM PC in 1981, but had been watching its own hardware advantage erode as compatible clone manufacturers, starting with Compaq, reverse-engineered IBM's published BIOS specifications, and began building functionally identical machines at lower prices. IBM wanted a next-generation operating system tightly integrated with its own hardware advantages, something that could help it reclaim technical differentiation in a market increasingly filled with interchangeable competitors. Microsoft's motivation was different but equally pragmatic. Microsoft's entire early success had been built on its DOS licensing relationship with IBM, and in the mid-1980s, Microsoft's leadership genuinely believed the company needed IBM's continued blessing and market power to remain relevant against the growing swarm of PC clone manufacturers. Neither company, at that specific moment, felt confident enough to go it alone. It's worth appreciating just how genuinely uncertain Microsoft's own long-term position actually looked from the inside during this period, since it's easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to assume Microsoft's eventual dominance was somehow always inevitable. In the mid-1980s, Microsoft was a successful but still comparatively modest software company, entirely dependent on its DOS licensing relationship with IBM for the bulk of its revenue and market credibility. IBM, by contrast, remained the single most powerful and prestigious name in all of computing, a company whose blessing could make or break a smaller software vendor's entire business trajectory. From Microsoft's own vantage point in 1985, continuing to work closely with IBM on OS/2 wasn't some minor side project. It looked like the single most important relationship the company needed to protect and nurture for its own long-term survival. So, in 1985, the two companies formally began joint development of OS/2, intended as the direct successor to DOS, a proper 32-bit operating system with real multitasking, and eventually a graphical interface called Presentation Manager, developed collaboratively between the two companies' engineering teams. For a genuine stretch of the late 1980s, this wasn't a one-sided arrangement where IBM did all the real work. Microsoft actively led significant portions of OS/2's development, and even released its own separately branded version of the software, sold directly under the name Microsoft OS/2. A detail that's easy to forget today, given how thoroughly OS/2 eventually became associated with IBM alone in popular memory, but one that makes what happened next considerably more pointed. This wasn't a case of Microsoft passively watching a partner's product from the sidelines. Microsoft was genuinely, actively building and selling OS/2 itself under its own name for years. Now here's where the story starts to turn. And we're understanding this specific internal division of labor matters enormously to what happened later. As OS/2 development progressed into the early 1990s, the two companies split responsibility for different pieces of the platform's future. IBM took primary responsibility for OS/2 version 1.3, continuing the existing 16-bit line, while Microsoft was specifically tasked with developing the next major leap forward, OS/2 version 2.0, a genuinely ambitious, ground-up 32-bit rewrite, intended to take full advantage of the more powerful 386 and 486 processors that had by then become the industry standard, moving well beyond what the aging 16-bit architecture underlying both DOS and Windows 3.0 could ever properly support. That division of labor put Microsoft in an extraordinarily consequential position. The company responsible for building the actual next-generation core of a competitor-adjacent platform, while simultaneously developing its own entirely separate product line under the Windows name. And in 1990, exactly at the moment OS/2 2.0's development was underway, Microsoft released Windows 3.0. Windows 3.0 wasn't simply another incremental update in a long line of previous commercially unsuccessful Windows releases. It was a genuine breakthrough, the first version of Windows that actually achieved real, substantial commercial success, driven by improved performance, a much more polished interface, and critically, Microsoft's own aggressive distribution strategy through OEM partnerships that ensured the software shipped pre-installed on an enormous and rapidly growing number of new PCs. Windows 3.0 sold in numbers that genuinely surprised the industry, moving millions of copies within its first year, numbers that dwarfed anything OS/2 had managed to achieve in its several years on the market up to that point. It's worth understanding just how unexpected that specific level of success actually was, even from inside Microsoft itself. Windows 1.0 and Windows 2.0, the two previous releases, had both been commercially unremarkable, generating relatively modest sales and widespread industry skepticism about whether a graphical layer sitting on top of DOS could ever genuinely compete with a proper, purpose-built operating system like OS/2 was specifically designed to be. Windows 3.0's breakthrough success wasn't something Microsoft's own leadership had confidently predicted going in. It caught much of the industry, quite possibly including parts of Microsoft itself, genuinely off guard, which is exactly what made it such a disruptive shock to the existing OS/2 partnership, rather than simply the fulfillment of some long-anticipated plan. That success fundamentally changed Microsoft's calculation about the entire OS/2 partnership. Here's the specific bind Microsoft found itself in, and it's worth sitting with the sheer, almost absurd conflict of interest at the center of it. Microsoft was simultaneously the lead developer building IBM's next-generation flagship operating system and the owner of a rapidly, unexpectedly successful competing product that made that same next-generation operating system largely unnecessary from Microsoft's own commercial perspective. Every engineering hour Microsoft's team spent perfecting OS/2 2.0 was, from Microsoft's own business standpoint, an hour spent building a superior product that could eventually cannibalize Windows' newfound momentum. That's not a sustainable position for any company to occupy for long, and Microsoft, unsurprisingly, didn't sustain it for long. The partnership formally dissolved somewhere between 1990 and 1991, though even pinning down an exact date is difficult, since the unraveling happened through a series of gradually escalating decisions, rather than one clean, single breaking point. What makes this genuinely more than an ordinary amicable business divorce is the specific manner in which Microsoft extracted itself and what it did with its position on the way out. As part of the actual separation, Microsoft handed over its OS/2 2.0 development work to IBM, while specifically retaining the rights to continue using and building on OS/2 version 1.3's underlying codebase for its own separate purposes, a codebase that would eventually become foundational to an entirely different Microsoft product line, Windows NT, the more robust, business-oriented operating system architecture that, decades later, still underlies every modern version of Windows running today. In other words, Microsoft didn't simply walk away from the partnership empty-handed. It walked away having extracted a genuinely valuable piece of shared intellectual property, repurposed for its own long-term architectural benefit, while leaving IBM to carry forward the specific, ground-up 32-bit rewrite, OS/2 2.0, largely on its own from that point forward. That alone would already be a genuinely consequential outcome for IBM to absorb. But the more pointed, more deliberately damaging part of what happened next is what Microsoft chose to do regarding developer tools, building serious, professional software. For any operating system platform requires proper development tools, compilers, debuggers, the software development kits that let outside programmers actually write applications for that platform. According to detailed technical retrospectives on this exact period, Microsoft specifically canceled its plans to continue providing those development tools for OS2 2.0, right at the moment IBM most needed a healthy, active ecosystem of outside developers building software for the platform it had just inherited sole responsibility for. It's worth sitting with exactly how damaging that specific decision actually was, in practical terms, rather than treating it as a minor administrative footnote. An operating system without a robust catalog of available software is, for most ordinary users and businesses, simply not a viable platform, regardless of how technically capable the underlying operating system itself actually is. IBM had just inherited full responsibility for finishing and shipping a genuinely ambitious, ground-up 32-bit operating system. And at that exact moment, its former partner and the entity that had led that platform's own development for years withdrew the specific tools third-party developers would have needed to actually build a real software ecosystem around it. That's not simply Microsoft focusing its own resources elsewhere in an ordinary, understandable business pivot. That's specifically withholding tooling that IBM needed at precisely the moment IBM needed it most. From the one company that understood exactly how consequential that gap would be, having built substantial portions of the underlying platform itself. Think about the specific position this put independent software developers in during exactly this critical window. A developer deciding whether to invest real time and money building an application for OS2 2.0 needed reliable compilers, debuggers, and documentation to actually do that work efficiently. With Microsoft's tooling support withdrawn right as IBM took over sole responsibility for the platform, developers faced a genuinely harder, more uncertain path, building for OS2 than for Windows, where Microsoft's own tooling remained well supported and continuously improved as a matter of course. Rational developers, weighing where to invest their limited time, predictably gravitated toward the platform with better tooling support, which, not coincidentally, happened to be the platform Microsoft itself was now singularly focused on promoting. That gap in available development tools bought Microsoft real, valuable time it used to prepare the next phase of its own competing strategy. With OS2 2.0 struggling to build a healthy developer ecosystem in the tooling vacuum Microsoft had left behind, Microsoft continued advancing Windows along two parallel, increasingly separate tracks. The consumer-facing Windows line, which would eventually produce Windows 95, and the more robust, business-oriented Windows NT line, built substantially on the OS2 1.3 codebase Microsoft had specifically retained rights to during the breakup. IBM, for its part, didn't simply give up. IBM continued developing OS2 independently through the early 1990s, and by most detailed technical accounts, the resulting product was genuinely impressive on its own merits. OS2 2.0, released in 1992, was a real, substantive 32-bit operating system, capable of properly exploiting the full power of the 486, and eventually Pentium processors that Windows 3.1, still trapped by its older 16-bit legacy architecture, simply couldn't match in the same way. OS2 2.0 had also embraced object-oriented programming concepts that were genuinely forward-looking for a mainstream consumer operating system at the time, similar in spirit to the kind of advanced architectural thinking Steve Jobs' next computing company had been pursuing separately with its own next-step operating system. This wasn't IBM producing a hollow, inferior consolation prize after losing Microsoft as a partner. By most detailed retrospective technical assessments, OS2 2.0 and its later successors were, in meaningful respects, technically ahead of what Windows was actually offering consumers during the same period. It's worth being specific about what technically ahead actually meant in practice for an ordinary user sitting in front of either machine, since abstract architectural superiority doesn't automatically translate into a better day-to-day experience. OS2 2.0's proper 32-bit preemptive multitasking meant a poorly behaved application was far less likely to bring the entire system crashing down compared to Windows 3.1's more fragile cooperative multitasking model, where one badly written program genuinely could freeze or crash the whole machine. For anyone running multiple demanding applications simultaneously, exactly the kind of business and technical use case IBM was specifically targeting, that stability difference wasn't a minor, abstract engineering footnote. It was a real, tangible, everyday difference in how reliably the computer actually worked. IBM eventually pushed further still, releasing OS2 Warp in 1994, specifically intended to bring the platform into the mainstream consumer market with improved ease of use and broader appeal beyond OS2's earlier, more technically oriented user base. And in genuinely important, if now largely forgotten pockets of the computing world, OS2 succeeded remarkably well, and for remarkably long. OS2's reputation for rock-solid stability made it a preferred choice for exactly the kind of infrastructure that values. Reliability above flashy features. Bank ATM machines, airport check-in kiosks, industrial control systems. Astonishingly, machines running OS2 in exactly these kinds of critical, unglamorous infrastructure roles continued operating for decades after the platform disappeared from ordinary consumer store shelves, a genuinely remarkable testament to just how technically solid the underlying engineering actually was, regardless of how the broader consumer market ultimately voted with its wallet. So if OS2 was genuinely this capable, why did it still lose so decisively to Windows in the consumer market that actually mattered most commercially? This is where the story moves beyond pure technical merit into the considerably messier realm of distribution, marketing, and structural competitive advantage. And it's worth being honest that Microsoft's conduct during the actual breakup, while genuinely consequential, wasn't the only factor working against OS2's broader commercial success. Microsoft's distribution advantage was, by this point, genuinely enormous and largely self-reinforcing. Windows shipped pre-installed on the overwhelming majority of new PCs sold by the early to mid-1990s, through exactly the kind of aggressive OEM licensing relationships this channel has covered in other contexts involving Microsoft's history, meaning millions of ordinary consumers encountered Windows by simple default without ever needing to actively seek out or choose it over any alternative. IBM, by contrast, struggled with marketing and positioning that multiple retrospective accounts describe as reflecting the company's more traditional, enterprise-oriented corporate culture rather than the fast-moving, consumer-focused instincts the personal computer software market increasingly demanded. Product naming and version messaging around OS2 was, by several contemporary accounts, genuinely confusing to ordinary consumers trying to understand exactly what they were being asked to buy and why it mattered. The actual turning point that sealed OS2's fate arrived in 1995, with Microsoft's launch of Windows 95, an event Microsoft treated less like an ordinary software release and more like a genuine cultural moment, complete with massive, unprecedented advertising campaigns and midnight store openings that generated the kind of mainstream media coverage no operating system launch had ever received before, and arguably none has fully replicated since. That level of marketing spectacle layered on top of Microsoft's already dominant OEM distribution advantage, made competing on technical merit alone an increasingly hopeless proposition for IBM, regardless of how genuinely capable OS2's own underlying engineering continued to be. IBM compounded its own difficulties during the same period by pursuing a separate, ultimately unsuccessful side venture, a joint operating system project with Apple called Taligent, intended to build an entirely new next-generation platform from scratch. Taligent consumed real engineering resources and executive attention that arguably should have stayed focused on strengthening OS2's existing position, and the project itself never produced a commercially successful product, representing yet another instance of IBM's resources being spread thin across multiple, competing strategic bets during exactly the period it most needed focused, sustained execution on its primary platform. It's worth pausing on Taligent specifically, since it's a genuinely illustrative example of exactly the kind of strategic distraction that can quietly doom an otherwise technically capable underdog platform entirely, independent of anything a rival company does to actively undermine it. IBM, in the early 1990s, was simultaneously trying to finish and market OS2 2.0 and Warp, defend its position against Microsoft's growing dominance, and build an entirely separate, unrelated next-generation operating system with Apple that ultimately went nowhere. Splitting genuinely scarce engineering talent and executive attention across that many simultaneous, competing priorities is exactly the kind of unforced strategic error that makes an already difficult competitive position measurably harder, regardless of what a rival company happens to be doing at the same time. It's worth pausing here to actually weigh these different contributing factors honestly against each other, rather than reducing this entire genuinely complicated story down to a single, simple villain. Microsoft's specific conduct during the actual breakup, retaining the valuable OS2 1.3 codebase for its own future architectural benefit, while specifically withholding development tools IBM needed at the exact moment it needed them most, represents a real documented instance of a company using its position as a departing partner to specifically disadvantage the partner it was leaving behind, rather than simply competing fairly afterward on the merits of two now separate products. That's genuinely different from and more pointed than simply outcompeting a rival through superior marketing or distribution advantages built independently. But it's also true that IBM's own corporate marketing instincts, its confusing product messaging, and its own strategic distraction through the Taligent side venture all contributed real independent weight to OS2's eventual commercial failure. meaning Microsoft's specific, more deliberate sabotage wasn't the sole cause of what happened, even though it was a genuinely consequential contributing factor. There's a specific irony worth naming directly here, since it connects this particular story to the broader pattern this channel has traced across multiple different eras of Microsoft's competitive history. The exact same basic playbook, build alongside or on top of a partner or rival's technology, gain enough independent strength and market position to no longer need that relationship, and then extract maximum value from the departing arrangement while leaving the other party structurally weakened, shows up again and again across Microsoft's history in different specific forms. The OS/2 breakup in 1990 and 1991, the documented AARD code, sabotage against digital research's DR-DOS a couple of years later, Joachim Kempen's anti-Linux OEM pressure campaign a decade after that. Each of these episodes involves a different specific competitor, a different specific decade, and a different specific technical mechanism, but the same underlying institutional instinct, using accumulated market position and in OS/2's specific case, genuine insider knowledge of a partner's own platform as leverage to systematically disadvantage that partner or competitor, rather than relying purely on open, fair competition to determine the outcome. It's worth being fair to the counter-argument here too, since a responsible treatment of this history should genuinely engage with it rather than dismiss it out of hand. Some retrospective accounts of this exact period argue that the eventual outcome, Windows winning, OS/2 losing, simply reflected what the broader market actually wanted, regardless of any specific conduct on Microsoft's part during the breakup itself. By 1990, this argument goes, it was already becoming clear that Windows had captured genuine consumer enthusiasm and momentum that OS/2, whatever its underlying technical merits, simply hadn't managed to generate on its own. IBM, in this reading, was a large, somewhat rudderless corporate entity that struggled to execute effectively in a fast-moving consumer software market regardless of what Microsoft did or didn't do on its way out the door. There's genuine truth in that argument too. IBM's own execution problems were real, and Microsoft's Windows 3.0 success genuinely did happen on its own commercial merits, independent of anything related to the OS/2 partnership's eventual unraveling. But that counterargument, even taken fully at face value, doesn't actually explain away the specific documented decision to withhold development tools from a platform Microsoft's own engineers had helped architect, at precisely the moment that platform most needed outside developer support to build a competitive software ecosystem. Market forces genuinely did favor Windows for a range of independent reasons. That reality coexists, rather than conflicts, with the separate, more specific fact that Microsoft made a deliberate choice to withhold something IBM needed, at a moment when Microsoft understood exactly how consequential that withholding would be, having been the party that built substantial portions of the very platform now being left to struggle without it. So where does OS/2 actually sit today in the broader arc of computing history, now that both the platform and the specific rivalry that shaped its fate have faded from most people's active memory? It's worth closing on that quieter, more persistent legacy because it's genuinely more interesting than simply another Microsoft won, competitor lost story. OS/2's genuinely excellent stability and reliability, the same qualities that made it technically competitive with Windows throughout the early 1990s, are exactly why it continued running quietly inside exactly the kind of infrastructure that values uptime above all else, for decades after it disappeared from ordinary consumer awareness. A genuine testament to solid engineering outlasting a lost consumer marketing battle by a truly remarkable margin. And the OS/2 1.3 codebase. Microsoft specifically retained during the breakup didn't simply disappear into Microsoft's own private history either. It became a genuine architectural ancestor of Windows NT, meaning a meaningful thread of OS/2's own underlying engineering DNA still runs, quietly and largely unacknowledged, through every modern version of Windows. People use today, including the machine you might be watching this video on right now, there's a genuinely strange, almost poetic irony sitting at the very center of that fact, worth naming directly. Before we close out, the operating system Microsoft is popularly remembered for having outcompeted and left behind didn't actually disappear from Microsoft's own products at all. A real piece of it has been running quietly inside every version of Windows built on the NT architecture for over 3 decades now, meaning OS/2 didn't simply lose to Windows in any clean, total sense. Part of it won, invisibly, folded permanently into the very platform that gets credited with having defeated it. I want to know if this is a piece of computing history you'd already encountered, or whether the specific mechanics of the OS/2 breakup, the withheld development tools, the retained codebase that became Windows NT's foundation, were new information to you, given how directly this connects to the broader pattern we've traced across other videos on this channel, from DRDOS to Linux. Do you see Microsoft's conduct here as a uniquely aggressive moment, or simply the first clear instance of a playbook the company would keep reusing for decades afterward? Tell me in the comments. I think tracing these specific mechanics, rather than just the broad outcome everyone already knows, is exactly the kind of history that deserves more careful attention than it usually gets. If you want more grounded coverage of the real documented history behind the operating systems and rivalries that shaped the computing world we still live in today, subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next video.